There is a specific kind of cold that settles into your bones when you realize the people you love are just waiting for you to die. It does not happen all at once, but rather in quiet, terrifying little moments that you try to ignore until the truth is screaming right in your face. My name is Arthur. I am 68 years old. For 40 years, I woke up before the sun to build my logistics and warehousing company from a single, rusted delivery box truck into a regional empire. I poured my youth, my sweat, and my very soul into concrete floors, loading docks, and endless rows of inventory. I created something out of absolutely nothing, weathering economic crashes and cutthroat competitors. And for a long time, I deeply believed that my lifetime of hard work would earn me a peaceful, respected retirement surrounded by a loving family. Evelyn was my second chance at love, or so I desperately wanted to believe. She is 15 years younger than me, vibrant, charming, and she always knew exactly what to say to make me feel like the most important man in the room. When we married 12 years ago, I happily and willingly took on her 2 children, Derek and Chloe. They were teenagers back then, and I wanted to be the strong father figure they never had. I paid for their expensive out-of-state college tuitions, bought their first vehicles, and covered the hefty security deposits on their luxury apartments. I wanted them to have the comfortable head start in life that I was never given. But gratitude is a highly perishable commodity in my household. Over the last few years, the atmosphere in my home shifted drastically. I went from being their respected provider and patriarch to being their personal, deeply annoying automated teller machine. Derek, who is now 29 years old, bounces from one spectacular failed startup idea to the next. He always needs just $50,000 more of seed money to make it big, completely unwilling to actually put in a hard day of physical or mental labor. Chloe, 27, treats my credit cards like her own personal inheritance advance. She routinely funds lavish, extended vacations to Europe while complaining to her friends that my choice in local restaurants is far too working class for her refined palate. Through all of this, Evelyn just completely enables them. She strokes my arm, tells me I work too hard, and then gently suggests I wire Derek a little extra cash just to keep the peace. The real awakening, the moment the blinders were violently ripped from my eyes, happened exactly 4 months ago. I was standing on the floor of my main distribution center when a crushing, suffocating weight settled on my chest. It was a minor heart attack, the doctors told me later. A stern warning from my aging body to slow down and step back. But the real, terrifying warning did not come from the cardiologist. It came from my family. I woke up in the stark, bright hospital room, groggy and hooked up to a symphony of beeping monitors. Evelyn, Derek, and Chloe were huddled together in the far corner of the room. They did not notice my eyes opening. They were not crying. They were not holding hands in prayer. Derek was frantically tapping on his phone, and I clearly heard him ask Evelyn if my living trust automatically transferred the commercial real estate deeds to her upon my passing, or if it had to go through a lengthy, complicated probate process. Chloe quickly chimed in, complaining in a harsh whisper that if my assets were temporarily frozen by the courts, she would have to cancel her upcoming 6-week spiritual retreat in Bali. Not a single word was spoken about my health, not a whisper of relief that I had survived the trauma. They were hovering over my hospital bed like vultures calculating the amount of meat left on a dying animal. I slowly closed my eyes again and pretended to remain unconscious. In that sterile room, listening to the rhythmic beat of my own weakened heart, the beautiful illusion of my happy, blended family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I survived, of course. I went home a week later, walking a little slower, speaking a little softer. Evelyn flawlessly played the role of the doting, worried wife. She fluffed my pillows, brought me low-sodium soups, and adjusted my blankets, completely unaware that I was watching her every single move with new, wide-open eyes. She thought I was a frail, fading old man who was rapidly losing his iron grip on his corporate empire. She had absolutely no idea that my mind was sharper than it had been in decades, and that I was already noticing the subtle, terrifying discrepancies in my personal bank statements. The isolation of being surrounded by people who do not truly care about you is a profound, heavy burden. I would sit in my leather armchair in the evenings, pretending to read the financial papers while listening to the sounds of my own house. I could hear Chloe in the guest room, laughing loudly on a video call, complaining about the archaic decor of her current living situation. I could hear Derek raiding my premium liquor cabinet, pouring generous glasses of scotch that cost more than my first month of rent 40 years ago. And Evelyn. Evelyn was the most dangerous of all, because she disguised her avarice with warm affection. She would bring me a cup of decaffeinated tea, kiss my forehead, and casually ask if I had gotten around to signing those updated tax forms her lawyer friend had recommended. It was a suffocating environment, an airless room where my lifelong legacy was slowly being suffocated by their endless, gaping entitlement. My business is not just a company to me. It is a breathing entity. 8 massive warehouses strategically placed across the tri-state area, a fleet of 70 heavy-duty transport vehicles, 300 full-time employees who rely directly on my judgment to feed their families and pay their mortgages. I built this empire on a solid foundation of absolute trust and unbreakable contracts. I know the true value of loyalty, and I now knew exactly what betrayal looked like when the mask finally slipped. The sheer audacity of Evelyn and her children thinking they could simply wait me out, waiting patiently for my heart to give out so they could liquidate my life's work to fund their designer lifestyles, ignited a cold, dark fire inside me. Just last Tuesday, I came downstairs to find Chloe casually reviewing a glossy real estate brochure for multi-million-dollar beachfront properties. When I politely asked her who was moving, she offered a tight, artificial smile and said she was just planning for the distant future. The future where I am nothing but a memory and my massive life insurance policy is a liquid reality. Meanwhile, Derek has started treating my company's chief financial officer like his own personal subordinate. He had the nerve to call him up and ask bizarre, probing questions about our quarterly profit margins and the exact value of our liquid assets. My chief financial officer, a fiercely loyal friend for over 20 years, called me in an absolute panic, asking why my stepson was suddenly acting like he owned the entire corporation. I had to calmly tell him to play along, to give Derek vague, boring answers while I figured out exactly what kind of game was being played under my own roof. Every single day became a grueling masterclass in biting my tongue. I had built a fortune by negotiating with cutthroat freight bosses and navigating ruthless supply chain crises. I knew how to read a room, how to spot a bluff, and how to stay perfectly silent when my opponent was making a critical mistake. I decided right then and there to apply those exact same corporate survival skills to my own marriage. I stopped arguing with Derek about his phantom businesses. I stopped questioning Chloe about her massive, inexplicable credit card statements. I simply paid the bills, nodded in agreement, and smiled the weak, tired smile of a defeated old man. They took my absolute silence for total submission. They genuinely thought the heart attack had broken my spirit, leaving me a docile, pliable source of infinite revenue. But my silence was not surrender. It was the quiet, necessary calm before an absolute storm. I was gathering data. I was quietly assessing the battlefield. I noted the minor inconsistencies in my private checking accounts. I documented the strange mail from legal firms I had never hired arriving addressed strictly to Evelyn. I paid close attention to the way my secure home office door sometimes felt like the handle had been tested while I was asleep. I knew they were greedy. I knew they were entitled. But I still wanted to desperately believe there was a legal and moral line they would not cross. I wanted to believe that Evelyn actually loved me, even just a little bit. That naive, foolish hope was the very last weakness I had left, and it was about to be burned away completely, because they were not just waiting for me to naturally pass away. They were actively making sinister plans to ensure they got their massive payday long before nature took its course. They thought they were the apex predators in this house. They completely forgot who built the cage. The greatest betrayals do not announce themselves with a deafening roar, but rather with a soft, almost imperceptible click of a door closing when you are not supposed to be home. I had always believed that the walls of my own house were the only absolute sanctuary I had left in this world, but the air inside them was about to turn completely toxic. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. My follow-up appointment with the top cardiologist in the city was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Evelyn had practically shoved me out the door that morning, kissing my cheek with a terrifyingly bright smile, telling me to take my time and treat myself to a slow, relaxing lunch afterward. My appointment, however, concluded by 2:45. My heart was performing adequately, the doctor said, though he strictly warned me to avoid sudden spikes in physical or emotional stress. I skipped the lunch, wanting nothing more than the comfort of my own armchair, and drove straight back to the estate, arriving just past 3:15. I pulled my modest sedan up the long, winding driveway and immediately noticed a sleek, silver European sports car parked haphazardly near the front steps. It did not belong to anyone in my family, and we were not expecting any guests. Rather than walking through the heavy oak front doors and announcing my arrival, I went around the side of the house. I entered quietly through the glass conservatory where I cultivate my Phalaenopsis orchids. Tending to those particular flowers requires meticulous attention to their complex root systems and a deep understanding of their incredibly slow, deliberate blooming cycles. It is a quiet discipline that constantly reminds me how true. Lasting growth requires immense patience and precise timing. My family, on the other hand, only understood the brutal demand for instant gratification. I stepped from the humid, earthy air of the conservatory into the shadowed hallway leading to the formal living room. I was just about to call out Evelyn's name when I heard a voice I did not recognize. It was a man's voice, smooth, rapid, and coated in a false, oily professionalism that I instantly recognized from decades of dealing with corporate bottom feeders. I froze. I pressed my back against the cold plaster of the hallway wall, completely hidden by the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, and held my breath. The discount on the physical assets is extremely aggressive. Evelyn, the strange man was saying, we are talking about purchasing 8 fully operational commercial warehouses, your proprietary logistics software, and 70 heavy transport vehicles for roughly 30 cents on the dollar. My private equity group is prepared to wire the funds by the end of next week, but we must have ironclad assurance that Arthur cannot contest this sale. My blood turned to absolute ice. 30 cents on the dollar. They were talking about the entirety of my empire, my life's work. Then I heard my wife speak. Her voice, usually so melodic and sweet when she wanted me to fund a home renovation, was sharp, dismissive, and utterly cold. Arthur is barely lucid most days, Evelyn said smoothly, telling a lie so massive it made my head spin. His heart condition has accelerated his cognitive decline. He sits in his chair staring at the wall. The business is failing because he is entirely incapable of managing it. That is why I had my legal counsel draft the durable power of attorney. He signed it yesterday morning. It gives me complete and total control over his personal estate and the primary holding company. A wave of sheer nausea washed over me. So strong I had to brace my hand against the wall to keep from collapsing. I had not signed anything. I had spent the entirety of yesterday morning resting in my study, locked away reading historical accounts of 19th century financial panics. She had forged my signature. The sheer audacity of the crime was staggering, stripping away any lingering doubt I had about her true character. And the notary? The liquidator asked, his tone laced with a knowing, cynical skepticism. Derek's voice chimed in, eager, arrogant, and dripping with unearned confidence. My buddy Marcus stamped it. He is a licensed public notary. He completely backdated the ledger and verified the signatures. It is entirely bulletproof. We just need the cash wired to the offshore trust account my mother set up in the Cayman Islands. Once the money is out of the country, Arthur will not have the physical energy or the legal capital to fight us in court. He will be completely locked out. Exactly, Chloe added, her tone thick with boredom and pure greed. Just finalize the paperwork. Vance, My mother deserves this money for putting up with his stubborn, penny-pinching attitude for the last 12 years. He is practically a ghost already. Let us just get this over with so we can move on with our lives. I stood there in the dark hallway, listening to my wife and my stepchildren eagerly divide my flesh and bone while I was still breathing. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, that for a fleeting, terrifying moment, I actually wished the heart attack had finished the job. It felt as though a frozen dagger had been plunged directly into my chest, twisting with every word they spoke. Evelyn was not just waiting for me to pass away. She was actively stealing my legacy, planning to leave me destitute, confused, and utterly humiliated in my final years, while she lived like royalty on the fortune I bled to build. But as the initial, crushing wave of grief subsided, a very different emotion took its place. It was not burning, explosive rage. It was a cold, hyper-focused clarity. The slick liquidator. Vance chuckled softly. Very well. If the power of attorney is legally binding and notarized, my firm will acquire the assets. I will have the final contracts drafted by Monday morning. $8 million, wired directly to your designated offshore account by Friday afternoon. But you must keep him completely isolated. No phone calls to his corporate lawyers. No spontaneous visits to the distribution centers. If he raises a red flag before the funds clear, my group will pull out immediately. Do not worry about Arthur, Evelyn said, her voice dripping with a terrifying contempt that I had never heard before. I control his medication, his schedule, and his phone. He is exactly where I want him. They clinked their glasses together. I actually heard the heavy crystal chime in the living room. They were toasting to my financial execution. I did not burst into the room. I did not scream or throw a heavy lamp against the wall or demand a divorce right then and there. 40 years of negotiating with ruthless competitors and surviving brutal market crashes had taught me one infallible rule. Never interrupt your enemy when they are making a fatal miscalculation. I backed away, stepping slowly and silently back into the humid embrace of the Orchid Conservatory. I let myself out the side door, walked down the driveway in the light rain, and got back into my vehicle. I drove 2 blocks away, parked under a large oak tree, and simply sat in the quiet cabin of my car for an entire hour, letting the cold reality wash over me and harden my resolve. Evelyn had calculated my physical weakness perfectly, but she had drastically underestimated the labyrinthine legal architecture I had built around my holding company over a decade ago. She genuinely believed that holding a piece of forged paper gave her the keys to the kingdom. She had absolutely no idea that I held the absolute power to change the locks entirely, rendering her stolen keys useless. Furthermore, she was placing her entire fraudulent scheme in the hands of her son's incompetent, criminal friend. That was a glaring vulnerability I could snap in half with a single, well-placed phone call. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate theft and family betrayal. They wanted to steal the very foundation of my life while smiling warmly in my face and adjusting my blankets. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white, staring blankly at the rain hitting the windshield. I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would let them sign their fraudulent contracts with the liquidator. I would let them taste the absolute thrill of their stolen victory. And then, when they thought they were utterly untouchable, I would pull the earth out from under their feet so violently, they would never be able to stand up again. I started the engine, my mind rapidly racing with complex legal maneuvers, asset relocation strategies, and the names of the most ruthless, brilliant men I knew in the financial sector. I was no longer a tired old man recovering from a failing heart. I was a man going to war, and my family had absolutely no idea they had just fired the opening shot. Surviving a betrayal requires you to become the very thing your enemies believe you to be: weak, blind, and rapidly fading away. The hardest performance of my life began the moment I pulled my car back into my own driveway. I walked through the heavy front doors, intentionally dragging my left foot just a fraction of an inch, letting my shoulders slump under an invisible, crushing weight. Evelyn rushed out of the kitchen, her face a mask of perfectly sculpted, theatrical concern. asking how the cardiologist appointment went. I offered her a trembling, exhausted sigh. I told her the doctor was deeply worried, that my heart was significantly weaker than we initially thought, and that I needed complete, undisturbed bed rest for the foreseeable future. The lie slipped from my lips with a terrifying, smooth ease. She bought it instantly. A brief, chilling flash of absolute triumph danced behind her eyes before she expertly masked it with a sympathetic, trembling pout. She practically escorted me up the winding staircase to my study, her hand resting gently on my back, promising to bring me my meals on a tray so I would not have to exert a single ounce of energy. By aggressively encouraging me to lock myself in my home office for my own supposed safety, she had unknowingly handed me the exact, impenetrable fortress I needed to meticulously dismantle her entire life. As soon as the heavy oak door clicked shut, and I heard her footsteps fade down the carpeted hallway, the frail, dying old man vanished completely. I moved swiftly to my heavy mahogany desk, powered up my private encrypted laptop, and began making the phone calls that would inevitably seal their financial doom. I did not call my regular corporate lawyers. They were far too close to the main holding company, and I could not risk a panicked junior partner accidentally tipping off Evelyn or her corrupt liquidator. Instead, I reached out to a man named Silas. Silas was an independent forensic accountant and a licensed private investigator I had retained 20 years ago to uncover a massive, highly sophisticated embezzlement ring within my own supply chain. He was ruthless, incredibly discreet, and he possessed a mind that viewed banking regulations not as laws, but as complex puzzles meant to be solved. He also owed me a significant, unspoken favor for keeping him out of federal legal trouble during that exact same corporate scandal. The methods Silas employed and the absolute loyalty he held for me would soon prove to be the most devastating weapon in my arsenal. But even I did not anticipate how deeply he would dig into the dark, rotting foundation of my wife's hidden life. I gave Silas full, unrestricted access to my personal banking mainframes, my private servers, and the complex routing numbers I had memorized over the decades. I told him to track every single penny that had moved through my household accounts over the last 36 months. I wanted to know where the money went, who authorized it, and exactly how long I had been sleeping next to a thief. For 3 agonizing, suffocating days, I played the bedridden invalid. Evelyn brought me lukewarm, unseasoned soup and weak, bitter tea, acting the part of the devoted, exhausted caregiver while she frantically texted the liquidator from the hallway. I could hear the rapid tapping of her phone keys through the thin wood of the door. When she entered the room, I would cough weakly, thank her for her immense kindness with a raspy voice, and wait for her to leave before diving right back into the secure, encrypted communications with Silas. It was a psychological torture unlike anything I had ever experienced in the brutal world of corporate logistics. To look into the eyes of the woman I had sworn to protect, knowing she was actively plotting to leave me destitute, required a level of cold, emotional detachment I did not know I possessed. On the evening of the 4th day, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long, dark shadows across my study, Silas sent me his preliminary dossier. The file was massive, and the depth of the financial rot he uncovered made my blood run entirely cold. Evelyn had not just started this scheme after my minor heart attack. The betrayal had been a slow, methodical, calculated bleeding for over 2 years. She had been subtly siphoning cash from our joint accounts with terrifying precision, moving $10,000 here, $15,000 there, expertly funneling the capital through dummy corporations registered in Chloe's name. She had quietly paid off Derek's massive, humiliating sports gambling debts on 4 separate occasions, masking the enormous wire transfers as home renovation expenses and charitable donations to fabricated overseas shelters. My own money, the capital I had bled on cold concrete warehouse floors to earn, had been financing their arrogant, utterly idle lives behind my back for over 24 months. But the most damning piece of evidence Silas uncovered was the digital trail of the forged power of attorney. Silas had looked deeply into Derek's friend, the public notary named Marcus, Marcus was not just a lazy, corrupt official. He was currently under quiet, active investigation by the state licensing board for authorizing fraudulent commercial property deeds for a local, organized crime syndicate. Silas had somehow obtained high-resolution digital copies of Marcus's backdated ledger. The signature on the document granting Evelyn total control of my life was a remarkably good forgery of my own handwriting. It was likely practiced by Evelyn hundreds of times late at night while I was sleeping beside her. However, it lacked the heavy, deliberate pressure I always apply to the final letter of my last name. It was a flawless visual copy, but entirely lacking the physical weight of my actual hand. I sat in the dim, blue light of my computer screen, the glowing numbers and damning photographs staring back at me like a silent, horrifying jury. It was Thursday night. According to the conversation I had eavesdropped on in the hallway, the liquidator was finalizing the massive purchase agreement by Monday morning. I had less than 96 hours before $8 million of my hard-earned assets were liquidated, packaged, and wired directly to an untouchable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. If that money successfully left the country, it would be gone forever, vanishing into a dark labyrinth of international banking laws that even Silas could not penetrate quickly enough. The sheer, terrifying reality of my situation finally settled over me like a heavy, suffocating winter blanket. My legacy, my entire life's work, the jobs of 300 loyal employees, and my own financial survival were teetering on the absolute edge of a massive, irreversible cliff. Evelyn genuinely thought she had won. She was currently downstairs in the formal dining room, drinking my expensive, imported wine, likely discussing with her children what color luxury yacht she was going to purchase with my stolen blood money. I closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click and walked over to the large bay window overlooking the sprawling back lawn of the estate. The rain had started falling again, washing over the expensive stone pathways I had paid for with years of missed holidays and 80-hour work weeks. I realized then, with absolute terrifying clarity, that I could not just step in and stop them. Stopping them legally would only result in a messy, highly public divorce, where Evelyn would inevitably play the victim and fight for half of my remaining assets in an agonizing, drawn-out court battle. She would drain me through endless litigation. No, simply blocking the fraudulent transaction was completely unacceptable. I needed to create a scenario so financially catastrophic, so legally binding, and so utterly devastating for them that they would voluntarily walk away with absolutely nothing, trapped completely by their own unbreakable, suffocating greed. I needed a plan that would turn their perfect crime into their own financial prison. I walked back to my desk, picked up my secure mobile phone, and dialed a number I had not called in over 15 years. It was time to bypass the accountants and call in the absolute heaviest legal artillery I knew. The frail, dying old man was going strictly back to sleep, and the ruthless, calculating warehouse boss was finally clocking in for one last, devastating shift. There is a distinct, metallic taste to absolute betrayal, but the antidote tastes remarkably like cold, merciless litigation. I sat in the dim light of my study, holding the heavy receiver to my ear as I listened to the phone ring out into the stormy Thursday night. I was not calling my standard corporate counsel. I was calling Richard Sterling. Richard and I went back 30 years, long before I had a fleet of trucks or a sprawling estate. We had spent our evenings studying the ruthless financial history of the 19th century together, analyzing exactly how the great railroad barons and banking tycoons built impenetrable legal fortresses around their immense wealth. Richard was not a modern, sensitive corporate mediator who settled delicate disputes over catered lunches. He was an aggressive, old-school estate attorney who viewed contract law as an absolute blood sport. When he finally answered his private line, his voice was just as sharp, gravelly, and unyielding as it had been 3 decades ago. I did not give him the agonizing details over the open phone line. I simply told him that hostile forces were actively inside the gates of my own home, and I needed his immediate physical presence and his brilliant, devious mind. By 6 o'clock the next morning, under the cover of a thick, gray Friday fog, I slipped out of my house before Evelyn or her parasitic children had even stirred from their expensive silk sheets. I drove to Richard's private office downtown. The city was still asleep, but his office was fully illuminated. I laid absolutely everything out on his massive mahogany desk. I presented the digital copies of the forged power of attorney, the backdated public notary ledger, the horrific financial trail Silas had uncovered, and the impending Monday morning deadline for the liquidator's purchase agreement. Richard did not express a single ounce of warm sympathy. Sympathy is utterly useless in a financial war. Instead, a cold, predatory smile slowly spread across his weathered face. He understood instantly the colossal mistake Evelyn had made. She and her slick liquidator, Vance, believed they were utilizing a stolen document to purchase the physical assets belonging to my primary holding company, Arthur Logistics. Richard leaned back in his heavy leather chair and proposed a strategy so flawlessly vindictive, so legally ironclad, that it actually took my breath away. We were not going to desperately block the fraudulent sale. We were going to eagerly let the liquidator buy the company, but first, we were going to completely and surgically hollow it out. You have always talked about wanting to do something substantial for the working class, Arthur, Richard said, tapping a heavy gold pen rhythmically against his desk. It is time to permanently secure your legacy, while simultaneously digging a financial grave for your wife. Over the next 9 hours, fueled by black coffee and sheer, unadulterated adrenaline, we drafted the foundational, irreversible documents for a massive philanthropic entity. We officially named it the Arthur Foundation for Vocational Advancement. Its sole, unbreakable legal mandate was to provide comprehensive trade school scholarships, heavy machinery certification training, and direct financial business grants to underprivileged youth. As I signed the initial charter, a profound wave of emotional catharsis washed over me. I thought about Derek, sleeping until noon, waiting for another handout to fund his gambling debts. I thought about Chloe, complaining about her luxury vacations. And then I thought about the young men and women who actually wanted to work with their hands, who knew the true, gritty value of a calloused palm and a hard day of physical labor. I wanted to give my entire fortune to them. I wanted to build the very foundation that I never had when I was starting out. The legal maneuver we executed next was an absolute masterpiece of aggressive corporate restructuring. As the sole legitimate owner and the absolute majority shareholder of Arthur Logistics, I possessed the unilateral, unquestionable legal authority to donate corporate assets at my own discretion. We drafted a rapid series of irrevocable transfer deeds. One by one, we moved the titles of my 8 massive commercial warehouses out of the primary holding company and directly into the newly formed, fully protected charitable trust. We officially transferred the state ownership registrations for all 70 of my heavy-duty transport vehicles. We completely reassigned the exclusive intellectual property rights for my proprietary supply chain management software. The process was exhaustive, requiring dozens of signatures and emergency notarizations from Richard's fiercely loyal, legally impeccable staff. With every stroke of my pen, I was giving away millions of dollars of physical wealth. Yet I had never felt richer or more powerful in my entire life. By 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the massive asset transfer was legally complete, signed, sealed, and securely filed with the highest state financial authorities. Arthur Logistics, the exact company Evelyn firmly believed she was selling to Vance for $8 million, still existed on paper. It still maintained its corporate tax identification number, its active bank routing details, and its fancy letterhead, but it was now entirely empty. It was a phantom corporation, a ghost ship sailing on an ocean of worthless, recycled paper. It owned absolutely zero physical assets, zero commercial real estate, and zero intellectual property. It was nothing more than a hollow, meaningless shell containing a brand name. If Evelyn genuinely thought her clumsily forged signature was a clever masterpiece, she was about to discover what a true, legally binding masterstroke looked like. When that slick, arrogant liquidator wired his millions of dollars on Monday morning, He would not be buying my life's work. He would be purchasing an empty cardboard box with my name written on the side. Furthermore, because Vance was knowingly engaging in a highly fraudulent transaction using a forged power of attorney, his own legal standing to demand a refund from Evelyn would be entirely compromised in any legitimate court of law. To ensure the trap was inescapable, Richard meticulously embedded a specific, deeply buried indemnification clause in the Foundation's charter. It was a brilliant legal tripwire that would guarantee the liquidator's very first aggressive move to reclaim his funds would automatically trigger a massive, devastating federal audit of his own private equity firm. I left Richard's office and drove back to my sprawling estate late Friday afternoon, feeling an incredible, unfamiliar lightness in my chest. My actual heart condition had terrified me just a few months ago, but finally severing the toxic, financial leeches from my life felt like taking my very first full, unburdened breath in over 12 years. I had successfully given away everything I owned to a noble, enduring cause, securing my historical legacy forever, while simultaneously building an inescapable financial prison for my betrayers. I parked my car in the long driveway and took a moment to compose myself. I needed to transition back into the role of the defeated, fading patriarch. I slumped my shoulders, adopted a hunched, uneven posture, and practiced the shallow, labored breathing of a dying man before walking slowly through the heavy front doors. Evelyn practically ambushed me in the grand foyer. She greeted me with a look of frantic, barely concealed panic, demanding to know where I'd been wandering all day without answering my mobile phone. I offered her a weak, pathetic, confused smile. I softly told her I had simply gone for a slow, disorienting drive to clear my cloudy head, and that I had gotten terribly lost on the highway for several hours. I played perfectly into her carefully constructed narrative of my rapid cognitive decline. She sighed heavily, expressing a chilling mixture of fake relief and genuine disgust. She gently took my arm and led me slowly up the winding staircase toward my bedroom, completely unaware that she was tenderly escorting a man who had just legally detonated her entire future. The sheer audacity of performing cognitive decline in your own home is an isolating, surreal experience that forces you to exist in two entirely separate realities at once. In one reality, I was a sharp, calculating architect who had just meticulously transferred the entire wealth of my logistics empire into an untouchable philanthropic fortress. In the other reality, the one I had to painfully inhabit the moment I woke up on Saturday morning, I was a shuffling, disoriented ghost of a man, blindly trusting the very family actively plotting my financial execution. Evelyn was vibrating with a terrifying, barely concealed manic energy all weekend. It was the frantic, giddy anticipation of a predator moments before the killing strike. She fluttered around the expansive house, insisting I remain confined to my heavy armchair in the library, claiming the slight draft in the hallways was too dangerous for my weakened heart. She brought me carefully curated trays of soft, unappetizing food, her voice dripping with a saccharine, theatrical sweetness that made my stomach physically churn. "Just rest, Arthur," she cooed on Saturday afternoon, adjusting a thick wool blanket over my knees despite the warm spring sunlight streaming through the tall windows. "You have worked far too hard for far too long. It is time for you to finally let go of all those heavy responsibilities and let me take care of everything." It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to laugh directly in her face. Let go. She had absolutely no idea how thoroughly I had already let go of the very assets she thought she was stealing. I offered her a slow, confused blink, a trembling smile, and a weak nod of agreement. The psychological toll of this performance was immense. I was forced to sit silently while Derek sauntered into the library, smelling faintly of expensive bourbon and cheap cologne, and openly mocked my physical state. He leaned against the heavy mahogany bookshelves, casually flipping a heavy brass paperweight in his hand. "Rough day, old man?" Derek asked, a cruel, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. "You look like you're about to dust away." "Do not worry about the warehouses. I had a long chat with the site managers yesterday. I told them a major restructuring was coming down the pipeline very soon. Got to modernize the dinosaur, you know? My blood pressure spiked dangerously. A genuine physical reaction to his breathtaking entitlement. He was actively terrorizing my loyal employees, men and women who had stood by me for decades, simply because he firmly believed he was days away from cashing a massive, fraudulent check. I wanted to stand up, grab him by the lapels of his designer jacket, and physically throw him out the front door. But I could not afford to break character, not when the trap was fully set, but the snare had not yet snapped shut. Instead, I let my jaw slacken slightly. I stared blankly at a spot on the wall just past his shoulder, muttering a disjointed, rambling sentence about supply chain delays from 1998. I watched his smirk widen into a look of absolute, dismissive contempt before he tossed the paperweight back onto the desk and walked out, clearly convinced I was completely oblivious to his hostile takeover. Sunday was even worse. Chloe had invited two of her equally insufferable, wealthy friends over for a lavish brunch on the back patio. Evelyn had explicitly forbidden me from joining them, citing the noise and the stress it would cause my fragile condition. However, the heavy French doors were left slightly ajar, and their shrill laughter carried easily into my quiet sanctuary. I sat in my armchair, a thick volume of military history open on my lap, listening as Chloe loudly and casually discussed her impending massive windfall. "Honestly, it is about time," Chloe announced to her friends, the clinking of champagne flutes echoing off the stone patio. "Mom has sacrificed the best years of her life dealing with his relentless, boring work ethic and his stupid, penny-pinching rules. We are finally going to have the liquid capital to actually live. I am already looking at securing a long-term lease on a villa in Tuscany for the entire summer. The sale finalizes tomorrow morning, and then we are completely free," her friends offered loud, sycophantic congratulations, entirely unbothered by the fact that they were toasting to the illegal liquidation of a dying man's entire livelihood. I closed my book slowly, the heavy thud masked by their raucous celebration. I had spent 12 years trying to guide Chloe, trying to teach her the value of a hard-earned dollar and the importance of professional integrity. It was a complete, agonizing failure, but the brutal clarity of her words erased any lingering doubt or guilt I might have harbored about my retaliation. By Sunday evening, the tension in the house was practically suffocating. Evelyn was practically glowing, unable to hide a triumphant, terrifying smile every time she looked at me. She was a woman standing on the absolute precipice of a massive, multi-million-dollar payday, and she genuinely believed she had orchestrated the perfect, victimless crime. She brought me a final cup of herbal tea before bed, her hand lingering on my shoulder for just a fraction of a second too long. "Tomorrow's a big day. Arthur," she whispered, her voice low and utterly devoid of genuine warmth. "A very big day for our family's future. You just get a good night's sleep." "I will handle everything." I looked up at her, maintaining the facade of a tired, broken man who had finally surrendered his empire. "Thank you, Evelyn," I rasped softly. "I know I can always trust you to do what is necessary." She kissed my forehead, a cold, dry gesture of absolute dismissal, and walked out of the room. I listened to the soft click of the bedroom door closing behind her, and then the distinct sound of the lock sliding into place from the outside. She was locking me in, physically ensuring I could not wander the house or make a late-night phone call that might disrupt her Monday morning masterpiece. It was the final insult, the absolute confirmation of my captive status in my own home. But as I sat alone in the dark, listening to the heavy silence of the sprawling estate, a slow, deep, and genuinely terrifying smile spread across my face. She had locked me in, entirely unaware that I was the one holding the only key to the vault, and that the vault itself had already been completely emptied. The liquidator was scheduled to execute the fraudulent purchase agreement at 9 o'clock the following morning. The trap was meticulously set, the bait was taken, and the devastating legal fallout was absolutely inevitable. I laid back against my pillows, staring up at the dark ceiling, and experienced the deepest, most restful sleep I had enjoyed in years. There is a unique, exquisite thrill in watching your enemies celebrate a victory that is actually their own execution. The trap was perfectly set, but I needed one final, grand public stage to gather all the players before the floor completely gave way beneath them. Monday morning broke with a crisp, clear sky. I heard the sharp click of the deadbolt sliding open, and Evelyn entered my bedroom carrying a silver tray with weak tea and dry toast. Her eyes were positively glowing with a greedy, feverish light. She kissed my cheek and cheerfully announced she had to run out for a few hours to handle some tedious, routine legal paperwork for my estate planning. I knew exactly where she was going. She was driving downtown to Vance's sleek corporate office to sign the forged documents and initiate the massive wire transfer. I gave her my best, trembling smile and told her to take her time. But as soon as her luxury sports utility vehicle disappeared down the long driveway, I picked up my encrypted phone and called my private concierge service. I had a very specific, incredibly expensive event to finalize. For weeks, I had been tentatively planning an annual community charity dinner, a philanthropic staple in our city that I usually funded through my primary holding company. Evelyn had repeatedly pressured me to cancel it this year, aggressively citing my health and the unnecessary expense. When she returned home just past noon, looking flush with criminal victory and smelling faintly of expensive celebratory champagne, I was waiting for her in the formal living room. I dropped the bomb. I told her the gala was happening tonight. I had paid for the entire ballroom at the Grand City Hotel using my private, untouchable retirement account. Evelyn was absolutely furious. Her face twisted into an ugly, harsh scowl as she dragged me into the hallway, away from the listening ears of the household staff. She fiercely hissed that I was far too fragile to attend a massive public function, and that parading around in a tuxedo was a ridiculous waste of my dwindling energy. What she actually meant was that she did not want any unpredictable public variables interfering with the final escrow clearing process scheduled for Tuesday morning. She wanted me quiet, hidden, and completely compliant until the $8 million safely hit her offshore account. But I played my role perfectly. I gripped her hands, making my own hands shake violently, and looked at her with wide, desperate eyes. I told her that my legacy in this city meant everything to me, and that if this was indeed my final year on Earth, I needed to see the community one last time. I pleaded with her, playing the part of a pathetic, fading man begging for one last night of dignity. She stared at me, her jaw tightly clenched. Finally, a cold, calculating light returned to her eyes. She realized that playing the fiercely supportive, doting wife at a highly publicized charity gala would look absolutely flawless for her public image, especially right before she forcefully took over my entire empire. She smoothed her designer dress, offered a tight, artificial smile, and agreed. The grand ballroom of the City Hotel was a masterpiece of crystal chandeliers and heavy velvet drapery. By 7 o'clock that evening, the room was packed with the city's elite. Derek and Chloe were there, sulking in a corner booth, complaining loudly about the lack of premium spirits at the open bar while checking their phones incessantly. They were just counting down the hours until they were impossibly rich. Evelyn pushed my wheelchair through the massive crowd. I had insisted on using the wheelchair, leaning heavily into the illusion of my total physical collapse. She accepted endless compliments from local politicians and business leaders, playing the tragic, strong caregiver with a sickening, flawless perfection. What Evelyn did not know, however, was that I had completely controlled the guest list. Scattered throughout the room, blending in perfectly with the high society crowd, were the newly appointed board directors of the Arthur Foundation for Vocational Advancement. They were tough, uncompromising men and women from the education and labor sectors, and they were the actual legal owners of everything Evelyn firmly believed she had just sold. And then, slipping through the main brass doors with a predator's easy grace, came Vance. I had my lawyer, Richard, send an anonymous, highly exclusive VIP invitation directly to Vance's private equity firm. I knew a corporate bottom feeder like him would never pass up an opportunity to rub shoulders with the city's wealthiest families. Evelyn's face drained of all color when she spotted him standing near the massive ice sculpture. She quickly abandoned my wheelchair and hurried over to him, furiously whispering in his ear, demanding to know what he was doing there. I watched Vance simply chuckle, take a slow sip of his expensive martini, and casually pat her shoulder. He thought he owned the room. He thought he owned me. As the lavish dinner service concluded, the heavy murmur of the crowd died down. It was time for the keynote address. Richard, who was standing quietly near the back exit clutching a thick leather briefcase, caught my eye and gave a single, sharp nod. I did not use the wheelchair to go to the stage. I slowly, painfully stood up, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. A hushed silence fell over the massive room as I made my way to the microphone. Evelyn stood near the front row, practically vibrating with anxious energy, holding her breath and standing ready to catch me if I fell. I gripped the heavy oak edges of the podium. I looked out over the sea of expectant faces. I saw Derek rolling his eyes. I saw Chloe checking her makeup in a silver compact mirror. I saw Vance smirking, swirling his drink, already calculating how much he would dismantle my industrial racking systems for scrap metal. "My friends," I began, my voice intentionally soft and raspy, forcing the entire room to lean in completely to hear my words. "We spend our entire lives building grand monuments to our own hard work. We lay bricks, we pour concrete, and we fiercely gather assets. We tell ourselves that these physical things are our true legacy." I paused, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch across the ballroom. I locked eyes directly with Evelyn. Her forced, sympathetic smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in her perfect porcelain mask. "But I have recently learned a very difficult, very profound lesson about the true nature of wealth," I continued, my voice suddenly growing a fraction stronger, the pathetic rasp disappearing entirely. "Physical assets are merely hollow vessels. A massive warehouse is just an empty shell if it does not serve a greater, lasting purpose. A bank account is just a meaningless string of numbers if it is fueled by pure greed and surrounded by absolute deception." A slight ripple of confusion washed over the front rows. Evelyn took a half step forward, her brow furrowing deeply. She knew my speeches. She knew I usually talked about supply chain logistics and market resilience. This was entirely off her approved script. "Tonight," I said, my voice now ringing clear, deep and loud across the grand ballroom, projecting with the full, commanding strength of a man half my age. "We are here to celebrate a massive transition. We are here to celebrate the complete emptying of the old, to make way entirely for the new. Some people believe they can take what does not belong to them. They firmly believe they can forge their own golden path by stealing the very foundation of another. But the truth always has a devastating way of balancing the ledger." I looked right at Vance. His arrogant, dismissive smirk had vanished completely. He was a smart, ruthless man who navigated the treacherous waters of hostile corporate takeovers for a living. And he was suddenly recognizing the distinct, terrifying tone of a predator who had just locked the doors from the inside. "I want to personally thank my wife, Evelyn," I said, my tone dripping with a heavy, unspoken irony that only a select few people in the room truly understood. "She has been entirely instrumental in helping me realize exactly who I am surrounded by, and exactly where my life's work truly belongs. Because of her recent, tireless efforts behind closed doors, my legacy is now entirely secure. It is legally bound, utterly untouchable, and forever out of the reach of those who wish to simply liquidate it for their own selfish gain." The applause that followed was polite, but incredibly uncertain and hesitant. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a heavy steel blade. Evelyn was staring at me in absolute, horrified shock, her perfectly manicured hands trembling at her sides. She did not understand the exact legal mechanics of what I had just said, but her primitive, parasitical survival instincts were screaming that something had gone catastrophically wrong. I stepped down from the podium, leaving the wooden cane leaning against the microphone stand. I refused to limp. I walked with a strong, steady, commanding stride back to my table, the crowd parting around me like water. The frail, dying old man was completely dead. I had buried him right there on the stage under the bright lights. The gala ended an hour later in a massive flurry of hushed whispers and tense, awkward goodbyes. Evelyn barely spoke a single word to me on the silent, suffocating car ride back to the estate. She stared blankly out the passenger window, clutching her designer purse like a life raft. The trap was now fully sprung, the steel jaws tightly locked around their ankles. The only thing left was to wait for the sun to rise, when the commercial banks opened their heavy glass doors and the arrogant liquidator finally attempted to claim his empty, hollow prize. The morning sun always feels agonizingly slow when you are eagerly waiting for a meticulously planted financial bomb to finally detonate. I sat perfectly still in the shadowed silence of my downstairs library, listening to the frantic, greedy footsteps of my family echoing above me, knowing their luxurious world was a few short hours away from complete and utter obliteration. It was Tuesday morning. The air in the sprawling estate was thick with a toxic, buzzing electricity. Upstairs, Evelyn, Derek, and Chloe were practically vibrating with pure, unadulterated avarice. According to the timeline I had silently monitored through Silas, the massive wire transfer from Vance's private equity firm was scheduled to clear the complex international banking protocols precisely at 9 o'clock. $8 million of stolen blood money was supposedly landing safely in Evelyn's untouchable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I could distinctly hear them in the massive chef's kitchen, violently popping the cork on a bottle of expensive vintage champagne. Derek was already loudly discussing the exact specifications of the custom Italian sports car he planned to order by noon, while Chloe shrilly demanded they immediately contact a private aviation broker for her extended, luxurious trip to Europe. They were aggressively celebrating their absolute victory, completely drunk on the illusion of their own criminal brilliance. I remained seated in my heavy leather armchair, my encrypted phone resting quietly on my lap. I was not waiting for an update from my wife. I was waiting for the inevitable, explosive call from my attorney, Richard, and my private investigator, Silas, while my family clinked their expensive crystal glasses just 2 rooms away. I calmly reviewed the final, devastating legal failsafe Richard and I had quietly buried deep within the Foundation's charter, wondering exactly how many minutes it would take for Vance's arrogant empire to fatally trigger it. That invisible tripwire would ensure the liquidator was just as thoroughly destroyed as my unfaithful wife. A final, brutal twist of the knife they would never see coming. At exactly 9:15, my phone silently vibrated. It was a highly secure text message from Silas. The message contained only 3 words: "The wire cleared." Evelyn actually possessed the money. For a fleeting, intensely intoxicating moment, she was a multi-millionaire, the undisputed wealthy queen of a stolen fortune. But a second text message arrived from Richard immediately after. He was physically standing by at my primary distribution center, flanked by my private security team and the newly appointed board directors of the Arthur Foundation. The trap was officially armed, and Vance was currently pulling his sleek silver vehicle into the loading dock parking lot to violently claim his prize. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to vividly imagine the beautiful, chaotic scene unfolding across the city. Vance, accompanied by his aggressive, expensive corporate acquisition lawyers, strutting confidently through the heavy steel doors of my main warehouse. He would loudly demand the site manager hand over the master keys and the secure server passwords, fully expecting the terrified compliance of a defeated, confused workforce. Instead, he would be greeted by Richard. I could almost hear Richard's gravelly, merciless voice echoing off the cold concrete walls as he calmly handed Vance the impenetrable, legally flawless trust documents. Vance would snatch the thick folder, his arrogant smirk rapidly dissolving into absolute, suffocating terror as his high-priced attorneys frantically scanned the airtight legal language. They would read the horrifying truth in stark, black and white ink. Arthur Logistics, the entity they had just aggressively purchased for $8 million, did not own a single heavy forklift, not a single square foot of commercial real estate, and not a single line of proprietary software code. They had aggressively purchased a completely hollow, worthless shell. The physical assets, the massive vehicles, the buildings, all of it belonged exclusively to a massive philanthropic charity that Vance had absolutely no legal authority to touch, dissolve, or liquidate. The psychological whiplash of realizing you have just been completely fleeced for millions of dollars by the very man you thought you were smoothly swindling is a devastating, crippling blow. According to the detailed timeline Silas later provided me, it took Vance exactly 4 minutes to completely lose his mind. He began screaming violently in the loading bay, throwing his expensive leather briefcase against a heavy steel support beam, desperately demanding his money back from Richard. But Richard simply smiled a cold, shark-like smile and calmly reminded Vance that he had willingly engaged in a highly fraudulent transaction using a forged power of attorney. If Vance attempted to publicly sue the empty shell company, he would be actively exposing his own massive criminal complicity in a sweeping federal fraud investigation. He was utterly trapped by his own arrogant greed. Back at the estate, the triumphant champagne celebration in my kitchen was abruptly and violently shattered. At 9:45, the heavy oak doors of the library burst open. Evelyn stood in the threshold, her face completely drained of all color, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. Her mobile phone was practically glued to her ear, and I could hear a man's voice on the other end screaming with a raw, unhinged fury. It was Vance. I slowly looked up from my lap, maintaining the steady, calm demeanor of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "You completely stupid, arrogant woman!" Vance roared through the tiny phone speaker, his voice violently distorted with sheer, blinding rage. The volume was so loud that Derek and Chloe crept into the doorway directly behind their mother, their champagne glasses instantly forgotten. "The holding company is completely empty. He transferred absolutely everything to a charitable trust last week. You sold me a worthless piece of paper." Evelyn started to stammer, her perfectly manicured hands shaking violently. "Vance, please, listen to me. There must be some sort of massive clerical mistake. The power of attorney was completely ironclad. Marcus notarized it himself. I have the money in the offshore account right now. We can just sit down and fix this." "I'm freezing the account!" Vance screamed, entirely cutting off her desperate pleading. "I have already contacted the International Fraud Division and my private banking liaisons. That wire transfer is officially locked down under a massive, multi-jurisdictional criminal investigation. You cannot touch a single penny of that money, Evelyn. And when the federal banking authorities fully realize you used a clumsily forged document to initiate this entire disaster, I am going to completely throw you to the wolves to save my own firm. You are going to federal prison." The phone line went completely dead. A suffocating, heavy silence violently slammed into the library. Evelyn slowly lowered the phone, her hands trembling so fiercely she dropped the expensive device onto the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. She looked at me, staring deeply into my eyes, desperately searching for the frail, confused old man she had successfully manipulated for years. She did not find him. She found the hardened, ruthless corporate architect of her complete financial execution. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I just stared back at her with a cold, absolute, merciless clarity. The terrifying reality of the situation rapidly cascaded through the room. Chloe let out a sharp, hysterical gasp, dropping her crystal glass. It shattered into a dozen pieces against the heavy wooden door frame. Derek turned completely white, his arrogant swagger evaporating instantly as he fully realized his massive gambling debts and lavish lifestyle were suddenly completely unfunded. He was violently staring down the barrel of genuine, inescapable poverty. "Arthur," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking, completely stripped of her highly theatrical warmth. "What did you do? Arthur, what did you just do to us?" I slowly stood up from my leather chair, I did not use the carved wooden cane. I stood entirely upright, rolling my shoulders back, allowing my full physical presence to command the room. I watched her eyes widen as she finally realized that the minor heart attack, the rapid cognitive decline, the pathetic weakness, it had all been a meticulous, grueling performance. "I did exactly what you asked me to do. Evelyn," I said, my voice steady, deep, and completely devoid of any human sympathy. I finally let go. I let go of the physical assets. I let go of the heavy burden. I let go of the naive, foolish belief that you actually loved me. Panic, pure and unadulterated, finally seized her. She lunged forward, grabbing my forearms, her fingernails digging painfully into my sleeves. She violently begged me to call Richard, to immediately reverse the trust, to fix the catastrophic disaster she had entirely brought upon herself. She desperately promised to cancel the sale, to stay by my side forever, spewing a rapid torrent of pathetic, transparent lies. But the heavy steel jaws of the trap had officially snapped shut, severing bone and sinew. There was absolutely no reversing the massive legal machinery I had set in motion. They had aggressively dug their own deep financial grave, blindly following their insatiable greed right into the dark earth. And I was simply the man who had calmly, quietly tossed the final shovel of dirt over their heads. I gently but firmly peeled her trembling hands off my arms and walked right past her, leaving her weeping hysterically on the floor of the library. The storm had fully arrived, and the sheer destruction was absolutely magnificent. There is a profound, heavy silence that falls over a house when the foundation of lies finally gives way and collapses completely into the basement. I stood in the center of my library, looking down at the woman who had spent 12 years pretending to love me, knowing the final, utterly devastating blow was waiting right outside the front door. The heavy brass knocker echoed through the grand foyer. I did not ask the household staff to answer it. I walked out of the library, leaving Evelyn sobbing hysterically on the expensive Persian rug, and pulled the massive oak door open myself. Richard, my fiercely aggressive estate attorney, stood on the front steps. Beside him was Silas, my brilliantly ruthless private investigator, clutching a thick leather briefcase. Flanking them were two broad-shouldered, incredibly serious men from my private corporate security team. I invited them inside with a sharp nod. We walked together into the formal living room. I calmly called out to the hallway, demanding that Evelyn, Derek, and Chloe join us immediately. The tone of my voice was not a request. It was an absolute, ironclad directive from a man who had finally reclaimed complete ownership of his domain. They slowly shuffled into the room, looking like completely terrified, cornered animals. Evelyn sank onto the velvet sofa, her hands shaking so violently she had to clasp them tightly between her knees. Derek stood nervously near the fireplace, his arrogant posture entirely gone, his eyes darting toward the heavy security guards blocking the exit. Chloe was openly weeping, her expensive mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks as the sheer reality of her impending poverty violently took hold. I stood beside the massive marble coffee table. Richard stood to my right, unlatching his briefcase with a sharp, definitive click. "For 12 years, I began, my voice cold, steady, and entirely devoid of the pathetic weakness I had faked for months. I provided everything for this family. I paid for the luxury cars, the endless vacations, the massive gambling debts, and the premium champagne you were just aggressively celebrating within my kitchen. I gave you a life of absolute privilege. And in return, you decided I was simply taking too long to die." Evelyn let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She tried to speak, to offer some pathetic, transparent excuse, but I raised my hand and completely silenced her. "You drastically underestimated me. Evelyn," I continued, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You thought my heart attack had broken my mind. You thought you could seamlessly forge my signature, steal my entire corporate empire, and sell it to a ruthless corporate liquidator for pennies on the dollar while I slept in the next room. You genuinely believed you were the smartest person in this house. I turned to Silas. He stepped forward and placed a massive, heavily bound stack of financial dossiers onto the marble table. The thud echoed loudly in the silent room. Silas has spent the last week meticulously documenting every single dime you have stolen from my private accounts over the last 24 months, I said, watching Evelyn's face drain of whatever pale color it had left. Every hidden wire transfer, every dummy corporation registered in Chloe's name, every single time you secretly bailed Derek out of his humiliating financial disasters. I have an absolute, undeniable paper trail of your massive, coordinated financial abuse. Next, Richard stepped forward. He pulled a crisp, white envelope from his briefcase and dropped it directly onto Evelyn's lap. Those are your divorce papers, I stated coldly. They were filed securely with the state courts early this morning. Because we have absolute, indisputable proof of your severe financial fraud and your active attempt to illegally liquidate my assets using a forged power of attorney, our prenuptial agreement is completely nullified. Furthermore, under the strict marital laws regarding criminal financial abuse, you are entitled to absolutely nothing. You will receive 0 alimony. You will receive 0 properties. You will leave this marriage with exactly the meager, insignificant bank account balance you brought into it 15 years ago. Chloe let out a loud, piercing wail, burying her face in her hands. But my apartment, she sobbed hysterically. The rent is due next week. My credit cards are entirely maxed out. What am I supposed to do? I looked at my stepdaughter, feeling absolutely 0 sympathy for a woman who had eagerly toasted to my financial execution just hours prior. I highly suggest you finally learn how to write a professional resume. Chloe, I answered smoothly. The endless luxury vacations are permanently canceled. Derek lunged forward, his face violently twisting with a desperate, ugly rage. You cannot just cut us off like this. I owe dangerous people a lot of money. If those wire transfers do not go through, they are going to come looking for me. The 2 massive security guards instantly stepped inward, their hands resting casually but firmly on their heavy-duty belts. Derek froze, rapidly backing away toward the fireplace, his false bravado crumbling into pure, unadulterated cowardice. Your debts are entirely your own problem now. Derek, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying register. You wanted to play the role of a high-rolling businessman using my blood and sweat. Now you get to experience the actual, brutal consequences of your own massive failures. I turned my attention back to Evelyn. She was staring blankly at the divorce papers on her lap, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her utter defeat. But I was not finished. There was one final, devastating reality she needed to fully comprehend before I walked out the door forever. You need to understand exactly what you have done to yourself today, I told her quietly, ensuring every single word pierced directly into her soul. Vance is not just an angry businessman. He represents a highly aggressive, incredibly vindictive private equity firm. You used a fraudulent document, stamped by a corrupt public notary who is currently under active federal investigation, to trick Vance into initiating a multi-million-dollar international wire transfer. That is massive, undeniable wire fraud. Evelyn slowly looked up at me, her entire body shaking with a profound, bone-chilling terror. The money is frozen, I continued mercilessly. Vance is currently unleashing a massive legal and criminal firestorm to recover his lost capital and save his own firm from a catastrophic federal audit. He is going to completely direct the authorities to you. Evelyn, I am entirely protected by the charitable trust. You, however, are completely exposed. You are going to have to face the furious liquidator, the corporate lawyers, and the federal justice system entirely on your own. I will not pay for your legal defense. I will not answer your desperate phone calls. You are officially erased from my life. I turned away from her, feeling an incredible, unfamiliar lightness in my chest. The toxic, suffocating weight I had carried in this house for over a decade was finally, permanently gone. My loyal housekeeper, who had silently witnessed their endless disrespect for years, had already packed my personal belongings into 3 large leather travel bags. They were sitting neatly by the front door. I signaled to the security guards, who easily picked up the heavy luggage and carried it out to my waiting vehicle. I did not offer a final, emotional goodbye. I did not look back at the crying, broken remnants of my ungrateful family. I simply walked out of the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. The air felt incredibly clean. I slid into the comfortable driver's seat of my car, started the engine, and drove slowly down the long, winding driveway, leaving them trapped in the crumbling, catastrophic ruins of their own blinding greed. I am driving downtown right now. I have a massive, fully funded philanthropic foundation to manage, and an entire generation of hardworking youth to support. I lost 12 years to a beautiful lie, but I firmly intend to spend the rest of my years building an unshakable, truthful legacy. I am 68 years old. My heart is beating strong and steady in my chest, and for the very first time in a long time, I finally feel completely, wonderfully alive. Thank you so much for watching my story until the very end. If you enjoyed hearing how I turned the tables on absolute betrayal, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates a brilliant outsmarting. Leave the word karma in the comments down below to let me know you made it all the way through. And please, do not forget to hit the hype button so this video reaches more viewers exactly like you.